and welcome. I'm Tim Zawislack, and in today's episode, we're exploring the evolving landscape of omnichannel retail and digital transformation. In what is a very special episode for me, I'm joined by Robert Shapiro, who spent 20 plus years at Jimmy Jazz and as its president, along with the team, built it into one of the most prolific streetwear chains in the country. And a word that gets kicked around a ton, but it's so true with what Jimmy Jazz was. It is a cultural icon, and he and his team built that. And for me, somebody who's transformed digital businesses over the years, I'm very excited to explore with Rob how successful retailers balance physical and digital experiences. We'll get into a little bit of omnichannel journeys for brands like Kith, brands like Nike, and we'll also get Rob's perspective on how advertising has evolved from these glossy print campaigns to today's very sophisticated targeting, and why the future of retail spaces is a lot more about creating brand embassies than just transaction points. And with that, Rob, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your just awesome journey in this space, if you would.
Retailer by accident. It wanted nothing to do with it, by the way. Out of college, became a salesman for a brief point, analyst for a brief point. Started a company in 1992 called S&D Menswear. It was in Brooklyn on Rockaway Parkway in Canarsie. It was our first store. And just to give you a long story short, it was a bit ahead of its time. At that time, as far as the products that were being sold to urban customers mostly, it was considered a price point business. So it was Levi's $29.99, Champion $29.99, some other things, but mostly fighting at price. We identified, myself and my first partner, we identified that if we were going to fight the supermarkets, hypermarts, we needed to be the butcher because we weren't fiscally solid like those guys. We weren't aware like they were, so we had to kind of outflank them. Where they sold those products at a price, we morphed into Nautica, Polo, Tommy, DKNY, and eventually into the European product, Versace, Moschino, Iceberg, Dolce Gabbana, etc. We had a good business going. We had one store, 365 days the first year, drove the company van, didn't make any money, didn't take any money out of the business because we were, both kids trying to really get the business off the ground. And then, lo and behold, around the turn of the century, Jimmy and I became partners in S&D. And we merged S&D into Jimmy Jazz, and then I became president of Jimmy Jazz. We still weren't that big. I think we had 40 some odd stores combined at that point. And we were growing slowly and nicely, but there were some things that Jimmy liked about me, and there was some things I loved about Jimmy as far as the infrastructure and the backbone. Early 2000s, Jimmy had an IT department that was almost unheard of.
Yeah.
When I first started in the early 90s, my first computer was a 386, by the way. We would hit the
Yeah.
button on Monday morning and we'd get our reports somewhere around Monday night, by the way. Wonderful thing. Anyway, so we grew that business. We acquired Man Alive and leapfrogged our business. And then we started growing nationwide, never west of the Mississippi. But then we penetrated that at some point as well. The journey was the merger of the companies, and we were an apparel company that was selling footwear at that point. But the successful companies were footwear companies selling apparel and not much apparel. So our strength was to blend both. We were tough kids, him and I. We were both young, a little bit brash, and we didn't take, stuff from anybody. I think we didn't have the best relationships with the vendors that we could have. And a lot of it was because we were wearing so many hats. It was a 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week business. Alarm went off at 2 a.m. You went there. You were doing logistics, you were doing HR, there were so many different things to be done. Somewhere along the way, we realized that we needed to hitch our wagon to some horse. And as great as all of our vendors were, Polo, Nautica, Tommy, DKNY, Nike was the horse. When you looked at all of the successful guys, the ones selling Nike were the most successful, did the most volume, were the most prestigious. So we decided to hitch our wagon to Nike. We flew out to Portland. We started our interaction of regular trips to Portland. And the rest is history. That's really when the explosive growth started happening. It was a much different business back then. There was no internet per se. There was no e-commerce. There was no online business. So on a release day, you would have people line up outside sometimes 1,000
The
people
release
lining
being
up
the
for
sorry, the
48
release
pairs.
being special limited shoes that would be Saturday morning, the Jordans, the
Correct.
ones, the Yeezys, or whatever.
Exactly. Exactly. And to go backwards, actually, in their original iteration, there were no OGs. We were actually on the
That's true.
12s, the
That's
13s,
true.
the 4s.
By the way, then yeah,
So that was
yeah,
before that, right?
yeah,
Before the
yeah.
vault. But it was certainly special. It was special times. It really was. It was a lot of fun. There was a lot of buzz. There was a lot of hype. And we learned a lot about retail. The really defining moment of our journey happened, I would say, somewhere about the 20s when the Nike edict came down and they grouped they kind of went introspective and they grouped their companies. So there were the large global players like Foot Locker, JD Sports, right? Dykeman. Then there were the regional players. Then there were the athletic specialty people. Then there were the people that could serve them in the women's business like Nordstrom. And what they created was a group called T24 that was the group that we were included in. And it was basically what they considered city specialty stores. So city specialty served the function for Nike. They deemed it as non-mall, although we were heavily mall stores, but we were urban malls for the most part. So we served the fastest, most loyal consumer that they had. As they started opening stores, which always made us nervous, we still served the consumer because we served an unbanked consumer. And that was somebody they couldn't reach. So as their e-commerce grew, as they rolled out their app, as they rolled out the loyalty program, many of these people didn't have an app or a loyalty program. Some people, and you kind of look 4 years ago, right, when they were trying to, the Biden administration was trying to roll out the internet service to rural areas. There's still people to this day, right, that don't have cable and computers. Although we laughed about Governor Hochul's talking about people in the inner city that don't know what computers are. But back then, we served the function, right? So we helped them reach a lot of the consumers that they couldn't reach. That was great, and it was wonderful. And then, it was, they turn up the water a little bit, right? So we were all boiling frogs in a pot that started out lukewarm. And, some jumped out and some eventually got swallowed up. Um, but what we did is we'd say, well, okay, great. Now here we are. Can we grow? No. Can we have more allocation? No. Those were always bad questions to ask. So I think it became show me. And then, we'd say, okay, what now? What do we do now? Well, we view you as a conduit to serve the consumer. So how are you going to present Nike to the customer that walks in? Right? So, okay, many of us were businessmen. Some of us graduated college. Some of us didn't. I had background in business and political science, which was very helpful at the time, versus a lot of our competitors that were just street guys that started businesses. So attraction, engagement, conversion, right? We went back to the original marketing thing. So, okay, attraction. How does your store look? A lot of these guys didn't have good looking stores. So Nike threw the gauntlet down, and the challenge was you have to make your store look great. Not good, but great, right? So, we and Jimmy was great with this, right? He really understood that we had to do this. So he allowed me to be creative. He allowed me to design, and I took an exorbitant amount of my time focusing on this. And so we renovated store after store, and it was great training. And unilaterally, it would come back where, it's like showing pictures of your kids to Nike, right? I'm like, here you go. And they'd be like, wow, kids are kind of ugly. And I'm like, oh, come on, guys. And then finally, beat down and you're on your
Yeah.
hands and your knees because you're worried that at one day they're going to come back and say no mas. And this is how we made a living. It was 65% of our business at the end. And we had no choice but to be in bed with Nike because we had hitched our horse to their wagon. So, I'd say, please tell me what I'm doing wrong so I can do it right. And they're like, no, we just don't like it. And they were very cryptic about it. And I think after, it was probably the Green Acres store, but it was after one of the doors I had designed where one of my mentors, this guy, Sam Siegel, he was like literally salesman number one. And
We've
at one
talked about
point
it.
he was
This
making,
guy's
I talk about him all the time, I know,
yeah,
because he's great, by the way.
yeah,
He's a legend. So at one point he was making more money than Phil Knight. And Knight called him in and said, I have good news and bad news. And the
yeah,
story goes, right? The good news is I'm going to pay you $1 million a year and I'm going to make you a salaried salesman, with a bonus. And Sam said, why would I want to take a pay cut? And the rumor is that because he was making more money than Phil Knight. But anyway, but he stayed on forever. He retired probably, I think it was pre-pandemic. It might have been just around the pandemic. So he, perfect exit timing for him. Always wore a suit, real gentleman, tough guy from Brooklyn, original tough guy from Brooklyn. But anyway, so Sam was generous enough to take me on a tour with Nike senior leadership, and he says, we're going to take you to all of these doors that are like theater. Now picture I want to tell you, it's 2014, 2015, somewhere in that neighborhood. And we get on a Sprinter van and we go to Hollister on Fifth Avenue, which had just opened up with all the giant digital screens. We went to Victoria's Secret on 34th Street, with all their cabinetry and luxe, selling $2 garments for $40,
Experience.
extreme
Yeah.
theater. And okay, great, got it. Now I'm hand sketching. I'm using CAD. I'm doing things that I always have done. And I said it's not enough. So I went to Jimmy and I said, I have an idea. I don't want to look like Foot Locker, because Foot Locker's House of Hoops looked great at the time. They had it was really revolutionary. And I said, this is the pinnacle to me. But if we bite it, everybody's going to know. So I want to design something that blows it out of the water, but is original, but functional, because these are the hard things to do, right? I might digress for a minute, but my S&D that made me famous on Fulton Street, downtown Brooklyn, which was the busiest street in New York City at the time. It's since gentrified, but back then it was craziness. I had a guy who worked in the theater department, and he made me a mountain, and that's how we put our shoes. So he literally took blocks of styrofoam, carved them out, and put the shoes on the mountain, on a gray mountain. It looked unbelievable. It just wasn't functional. So, the concept was, how do I do that now, but make it functional? So I reached out to a design firm in the United Kingdom, and we started going back and forth with ideas, and they had done some really, really high-end boutiques. So I sent them 3 folders.
Though, right? That was the sort of
not in our space at all, which is what I liked, right? So I sent them 3 folders. These are boutiques, inclusive of the Foot Locker House of Hoops, that I really, really like, but I don't want to look like, because it's too obvious. These are boutiques that blow my mind globally now, and some of them very small, 2,000 square feet, 1,000 square feet. We were typically 3 to 10 in our doors. Everything about them is perfect, except they're not functional. And these are stores I don't want to look like. They're a dying breed. They're dinosaurs. I just don't want to look like. So they got it, and we started going back and forth. They would send me designs. I would tweak them. They would send it back. I would tweak it again, and they were great, because they were so ahead of the time. They had 3D renderings. I mean, when I actually would sometimes share them with Nike along the way, which of course they didn't condone nor hate, they'd say, "Are these pictures?" And I said, "No, they're actually 3D renderings," because it was before AI. It was so advanced. So this went on for probably a good 2 or 3 months, and it was very frustrating. So I sat with Jimmy and we discussed what we're going to do next, and we said, what, let's just fly them out here, and I'll throw them in my car. And it's New York City. I'll take them to every great boutique in the metropolitan area that I can think of. So I spent about a week with these guys, and we drove to every single boutique and some non-boutiques that I really liked, took a ton of pictures, and I think we got on the same page. I had a great dinner at Beauty in Essex, first time I'd ever been there at that point, which also was incorporated into the store. I don't know if you've ever been to Beauty in Essex, but you walk in and it's a pawn shop, not pawn, and then they slide the back door open and you walk into the restaurant. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. Again, 2014 or whatever it was, but it was such a great concept. So that is what the genesis was. And then we decided, let's renovate the first store in this concept. Was a 2-floor store. It's about 10,000 square foot store in Harlem. At that point was ground zero for everything. It just made perfect sense. This was the Jimmy Jazz next to the Apollo. So that made perfect sense. And that, much like my S&D store a long time ago on Fulton Street, is kind of what made Jimmy Jazz famous at the time. Not that we weren't, but I think it gave us, I hate to use the word respect, but in some ways the word respect. And it was revolutionary. It was way ahead of its time. I remember going up there because, when it's your baby, you want to go up there and look. And I'd see all my competitors in their Sprinter vans coming through. And I knew that we had done a good job at that point. And so I think, to take this very long story around, I think that was the beginning of the theater for Jimmy Jazz. And so, when I hired you, Tim, that's what you knew, but it was a long journey to get there. And then obviously lots of things happened after that. Now at that point we had about 170 doors, and that door cost us about $3 million to renovate, all in between the flights and the design and everything else that we did. Now how do you scale that? So then I did what I do best, and that was negotiating. So we had to bring in construction crews, we had to bring in cabinet makers, we had to bring in digital people, we had to bring in sign people. So between the bids and knowing, and obviously the best part of negotiating is knowing exactly how much things cost. We got that typical build out down below $500,000.
Wow. From 3 million, the
We
initial
said, you know,
one, you were able to figure out
correct.
how to scale that and really blow
That's
that
right.
up.
Economies of scale, right? So, buy more,
Yeah.
save more. So if I give you 30 doors at a time, how much is it going to cost? And so we were able to really, really scale that up. But that took probably another 18 months to really get going. But once we did, we ran through the chain in probably less than a nickel. So we got almost all the doors, and we tiered them ABC, right, depending on the prominence of the mall and the strip center, et cetera. But all doors we touched, and it really was a good deal. It made the stores
So
look
so
great.
that really became, look, I'm digital my whole life, but I've been running around saying for years, look, for every dollar of retail commerce that's done today, 75 cents is still done out of brick and mortar. And I don't know if it's really going to get much below that threshold, maybe a little bit, but like I don't think it's dramatically going to be so. I mean, people sort of lose sight of the fact that, there's tens and tens of thousands of points of distribution, for a lot of these brands out in the world, and they're just critical touch points for that consumer.
Well, I think it's a shifting landscape. Tim. I don't think you're wrong with your percentages, although I have my youngest daughter is 13. So her shopping habits are completely different than my other children. I go full spread, 33 to 13, right? But completely, completely different. She doesn't watch TV.
True. Yeah.
Um, she doesn't hang out at the mall. She likes TikTok, which probably influences her more than I care to. And I don't know if you saw, but President Trump is giving him another reprieve if they don't sell till June now.
That's gonna be interesting. We can go down a whole rabbit hole on that.
Yeah, well, that's a
Yeah, yeah,
political
yeah.
thing, by the way. Yeah. And if they really want to get it right, do like what the EU did. Just say you can't gather this information, because if that's what they're really concerned about, by the way, can't if you wanna have TikTok in the US, can't gather the information. Forget the servers, because that's all BS anyway. You can't collect data. You can't, when the app is off. You can't follow them around. There's lots of things that you and I could talk about
That
forever.
is very true. Very, very
But getting back to
yeah.
my daughter, uh, I'll ask her questions, and I'll say, "How did you hear about Shein and TikTok then?" "What do you mean TikTok? They advertise? What is advertised?" She said, "No, no, 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 no. There was a lady talking about it, and she was showing all the stuff that she bought for this price, and it looked really good quality." And I said, "So it's a commercial without being a commercial." And they figured it out. I know when you were with us, we were trying to figure out, how do we monetize TikTok? I don't understand it. And that would it became influencer based. That was the genius of it. The one I still can't figure out, by the way, is Snapchat. But my kids use it as a
And that's
communication
what
tool.
it is. That's exactly what it is. And you have a lot of brands out there. That's a awesome CRM play. Chase people on their journey. That's a touch point. It's probably not the be all end all touch point. LinkedIn is not dissimilar, right? It's a different tone of voice that you're going to be talking to people in, but like people are on LinkedIn, they're on Snapchat. It's an elevator stop along the way. And there's some brands that have figured out that CPMs there, CPCs there aren't as expensive as they are on, say, YouTube, on Prime Video, things like this. So it can be a pretty guerrilla marketing sort of play to get into that with like the right message.
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah, no, I was just gonna say, we were selling products that, while they weren't commoditized, I mean, Jordans were not a commodity, but the Jordan that we sold was exactly the same Jordan that Snipes sold, that JD sold, that Foot sold. It's the exact same shoe, right? Exact same product. I'd love to get your thoughts on the importance and the relevance of the stores that you built and how that demonstrated like that brand, that we were the brand, that you wanted to buy your shoe from us, you wanted to buy Air Force Ones from us as opposed to Snipes or JD or whoever down the street. And just curious your thoughts on why us versus everybody else.
So I think the important thing when I set out to redesign what Jimmy Jazz looked like was rebranding Jimmy Jazz. So you don't remember the green bag with the Gap font,
I saw, I
but that
saw.
Okay, so that was again when Jimmy, I think it was Masha Kedmi that had designed that for him. But when whoever had designed that for him in
Yeah.
1988, it was
Yeah.
revolutionary. It was beautiful. But 20 years later, it was an eyesore. The shape, the color, the font, everything. So we unbeknownst to Jimmy at the time, I was rebranding Jimmy Jazz from the bottom up. And again, if I had gone and said, look, I was his partner in S&D, right? So if I had gone to him and said, your company's terrible, your company's great, but it's not great enough, I think it would have been my analogy of, yeah, your kids are really ugly. So we did it subtly, and it was a little like, Missouri. It was show me, and we did a backpack bag. So during back to school, every pair of sneakers we we gave you, we put in a backpack, and the kids had the backpack. He was very skeptical because it was about four
I remember
times the cost of a regular
that.
bag. But I would constantly, as I was driving home, if I was on the subway, I would take pictures of people wearing them, and I'd say we couldn't afford the advertising that this bag is giving us. And at that point, advertising was shifting, right? There was still cable, people were still watching TV, there was no streaming, but it was still shifting. When I started my business in the 90s, we would take a full page ad in Source magazine, in Vibe magazine. We then figured out that we could do local cable in Brooklyn during the Knick games only, and we made a video. We actually had up and coming rappers, some who ended up in the Wu-Tang Clan, by the way, in our video, and we filmed it in our flagship store in downtown Brooklyn in Fulton Street, and we would only advertise right before halftime because we knew that everybody would be watching right before halftime. And then at halftime, they'd probably either bounce or go get a sandwich or whatever. But, and then in the fourth quarter, which was hit or miss because the fourth quarter, if they were losing by a lot, you would already leave. And if they were winning, you'd stay around, right? But we knew right before halftime, we had captive audience, and it was very cost effective. So we had to brand ourselves. And those are the cool things that S&D did, right? To fight the big guys. So even though people think Jimmy Jazz was a giant corporation, we weren't. Foot Locker. Foot Locker was the behemoth at the point. Finish Line was the second behemoth at the point. There was Dick's who had bought Galleons at that point. They were big. So we had to appear like we were their size. And so a lot of that was branding the store, branding the bags inside the store. If you remember, I would hit you with the Jimmy Jazz logo as you got through your journey of the store. So I was branding as you walked in the door. I was branding outside. We would do 8 sheets. We would do all kinds of things around the store. To answer your question rather long-windedly, I apologize, Tim. My goal was I want if you're going to start your journey for a particular shoe, your Air Force One, not a release shoe, right? An allocated shoe. But if you're going to start your journey for an Air Force One, I wanted to be the first place that you went to. So at that point, it was the first store in the neighborhood you went to, which turned into the first store in the neighborhood or the first website you went to, right? Because omnichannel became a buzzword, but it became the way people shop. There was no doubt about it. So along your journey, what's the first place? And I would ask consumers in the street sometimes, where do you go? And as Jimmy Jazz got stronger, we had some regional competitors that were frustrating me because I would get from our managers, from our employees, no, this guy's better. He's got the exclusives. That's what they always say. I'm like, what do you mean he's got the? Come on, I'd grab him by the hand and I'd walk into their store and I said, what do you mean the exclusive? Show me these exclusives. By the way, it was all perception. They didn't have anything we didn't
Wow.
have.
Wow.
But perception is reality. And if that's what they believe, then I had to change their perception. So that was the build out of the store, right? So look, there's a point when you make the store look so good that you're going to lose some of your foundation customers. Pyramid, right? Top of the pyramid, small, bottom, big. At the bottom of the pyramid are some of the consumers that shop by price. And there was a possibility that we were going to lose some of those consumers because the store looked too good. And immediately they said, oh, you guys are too expensive.
Yeah, if you were walking
And I
down the
think
street, right, in some of these stores, like you would have just it was like a desert oasis. You would have whatever on the street, and then this like magnificent, beautifully, thoughtfully architected, beautiful storefront. And it was like it was honest to God, like you're assuming once you even get in, you'd have to walk past. It's like, oh my God, like it was like another planet. These stores looked like nothing else up and down the streets.
And that was the intention, Tim. So if you remember, even our storefront was three-dimensional. Remember the basket weave effect, right? So my wife has some bad habits. She loves going to the Miracle Mile in Manhasset, shopping at Hirschleifers. There was a chain of stores called Intimix there, and they had a beautiful basket weave storefront out of marble. I can't
Didn't
even
realize that's where
imagine what it
that
cost.
came from. That
That's where it came from. I'd like to take full
I
credit,
thought
but I can't.
you that was a Bottega Veneta thing that you were doing there.
No, 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 no. It was actually
Wow.
Intermix. It was, and by the way, it was the only one because as I traveled the country, I've seen many Intermixes, and that was the only one that had it. And so that's where the idea came from. Then, which, by the way, was cost prohibitive. At the storefront itself would have been $300,000, right? So that's what I'm talking about. So I worked with the sign maker, and he made it out of sheet metal, and it just
Right.
didn't look right. Black sheet metal, right? Something didn't look right, and it was bothering me. Then he had a machine, CNC machine, excuse me. He had perforated it, and it started to look better. It looked lighter, it looked cooler. But it was silver now. So we tried black, we tried silver, it didn't work. I'm in Vegas for a trade show. I get picked up at the airport by a cab. This is before Uber, so that's how long ago it was. And the guy, I don't know if you're familiar with long haul, but what they treat you like you're an out of towner, like you don't know what's going on. And they're like, "Oh, I'm going to give you a faster way," and they take you
There.
to the highway, double the amount of miles, right? It might even be faster, but it's double the amount of miles. And by the way, it might be 6% faster. So I'm angry. I tell the guy who long hauled me. I'm really pissed off, by the way. Brooklyn guy, right? Um, but they just had built the T-Mobile Center, and it was a beautiful brass color. And as the guy's long hauling me, I take my
Yeah, yeah.
camera and I start taking pictures of it. And I said, bingo. And I don't remember. It was 1 in the morning, Vegas time when I got in at that point. New York time, pardon me. But, I called the sign maker and I said, I got it. I'm sending this
Wow.
to you right now. And I texted
Wow.
him pictures. And he didn't sleep. He was up all night and he was doing on his CAD. And I was like, wow, this is beautiful. And that's who we got it. So thank you for the compliment, but that was what the goal was, right? You noticed that storefront. You could be on a bus, public transportation, you could be in a car, you could be walking, you could be in an urban center, you could be in a strip center. You knew that storefront was Jimmy Jazz, and it was unique to Jimmy Jazz, and it was luxurious, and it was beautiful, and it was cool. There were just a lot, whatever your interpretation was, there were a lot of good things
It was
about it.
all good. I mean, it really, really was. You started going down the road of Wu Tang and those guys. If you could, because look, this was so unique to Jimmy Jazz. I've never been a part of anything. I learned from this. I would continue to learn from this. As I get older and get further away and sort of get some perspective on it. You built with Jimmy community around this brand. And that happened, both at look, you had a lot of these, cultural, iconic guys that shopped with us when they were, just coming up, whatever. And then they obviously made it. And then, they, name checked us and the music and their art and whatever. And that was sort of one thing of the cultural piece. Another one that just continued to knock me over. We had people that worked with us. They worked, eat, slept, worshiped, prayed, whatever in the community. And we were able to there was a lady that was running a store in one of the Carolinas. I've forgotten which store, but she was part of one of these mega churches down there. And she was very, very involved with it. And there was a pastor of that. And then he was himself.
Nikia.
Thank you. I completely forgot about her. And just talk a little bit about, sort of, both sides of that, if you could, and how that blew into, what it became from like the cultural guys, but also at the grassroots, because that was so, so important to the whole thing.
So I think so. It all morphed, right? When Jimmy and I had become partners in 2000, we didn't have a marketing department. It was me and him thinking on the fly, right? So we had to develop a marketing department. I took a lot. Look, doing business with Nike was a master's in education. They at the time they might have been 18 billion. They were talking about, Mark Parker was talking about going to 52 billion. That's larger than almost every GDP in the world except for maybe the top 15, right? So I would just absorb. It was wonderful. It was like going to school. Every time I could get to Portland, every time they had a sell in, it was an absorption of knowledge. It was wonderful. They always talked about the community. They always talked about how do we take the next generation of youth and turn them into Nike consumers. And so that was the focus at Jimmy Jazz as well. So I just told you about the Air Force One analogy about how do we become the first place that they start their journey. And one of those ways was to be a pillar of the community. In some neighborhoods, Williamsburg, and I'm not talking about the modern Williamsburg, I'm talking about the hood Williamsburg, we might have been the department store. So if there
Roughly how
was
big was that store in Williamsburg?
tiny, maybe 2,500 square feet.
You
But
were that to
we
them.
literally on Graham Avenue, Avenue de Puerto Rico, we were the department store. So whatever your footwear was, whatever your apparel was, whatever your accessories were, back to school, Christmas, Easter.
That's where
Easter
I
was a thing
wanted to
back
go with
then.
this stuff. It's like those moments because they're so important.
Oh, it was unbelievable. You know, they were big cultural moments, right? And so we were of the culture, but not 100% where we should have been until we started hiring really from the community. It was very important that we looked and acted like the community. And I'm talking organically. You can't force it. Funny, we had a guy who was doing marketing for us when we opened our very first store outside of New York City in the military circle in Virginia. It was near Norfolk Fleet. And we had this Windmaster that we had, two-sided sign that you'd put outside the mall store, and it said New York's #1 shop for apparel and footwear, Jimmy Jazz, is now in Virginia. That's a
They
slap
don't
in the
want.
face. People were angry, Tim. Angry. You know, who are these interlopers? And so, you know, I realized and baptism by fire is the best
Yeah,
thing you can
true.
do. But I realized you need to be of the community. So you had to we said, by the way, our district manager was from New York. Our manager was from New York. We transplanted him. It was great, right? People you can trust. So I think what we needed to do was now we needed, and this was a good lesson as we started growing. Mid Atlantic was our first foray to hire people from the community and to teach us about the community because the seasons were different, the selections were different, the people were different. You know, that became really important on how we fit into community. So Dean Nakia thing, she was religious. Not everybody was religious, but there was much more Bible Belt down in the South than there was up in the North. So that became an important thing. How do we connect and communicate with the churches? You know, and there were many different churches, right? There was Pentecostal, there were all different kinds, but how do we communicate with them? When the floods happened, Katrina, which was a disaster, by the way, we had lost one of our doors at that point. But in Baton Rouge, I don't know if you remember when the Mississippi flooded, and again, I'm losing track of time, but that might have been 16, 2015, somewhere around there. We literally loaded up a tractor trailer and went to the Cortana Mall and just gave everything away. Gave it away. You know, the people were so destitute at that point. They were waiting online for food. They lost everything. They lost their apparel. They lost their footwear. They lost their houses. Everything. So it was just earnest. It wasn't because we wanted anything. These were our people, and these were the people that worked for us. Now I would say that it came back in spades, business wise, but that wasn't the
No,
intention.
and
The
that's
intention
what's
was just to
interesting.
help them out.
That was the lesson. Look, I came along towards the end of this whole journey, but what continues to just blow me away was the equity that you were very unintentionally and just organically creating in these communities that we serve. That when the summer of 2020, I was there for this summer of 20, and it was just a very, very difficult time for the country. I remember well that we had 170 odd doors. We had problems, and you're closer to this, but we had problems with maybe two or three of them. Whereas every single one of our peers out there just got pillaged. I mean, they just absolutely got
Yeah,
destroyed. And it was as if we had like lamb's blood over our doors. It was I've never experienced anything like that.
says the guy from Greenwich,
But true,
Connecticut.
no, but it's true. It's true. I'd never seen anything like that. And it was like, it was unbelievable. It was, looping it back to digital and omnichannel, that entire summer, brands that were not authentic and they were, to your point, years ago, interlopers and looked at as like not truly 100% authentic or sincere in what they're doing or not of their communities, they got destroyed. And the more they said, the worse it got. The patron saint of this industry, Virgil Abloh, rest in peace. The more he spoke on social, the worse it got for him.
It was early, Tim, if you remember, it was early learning about the internet trolls and the keyboard
Yes,
warriors,
yes.
right? And so we took everything very seriously as well because we didn't know any better. But that might have only been, even with Virgil, it might have only been 1 or 2%, right? Because 98% might have agreed with him. But it amplified so loudly. And to your point, the companies that posted a letter on Instagram, we stand with, it was so disgenuine. It just didn't make sense, and it looked phony. And we never wanted to look phony. We always wanted to be authentic.
If you put love in every single touch point of what you do as a business, whether it's physical, whether it's omni, whether it's digital, whether it's whatever. I just believe that that comes across like your storefront with the basket weave. That came out of love. That was like, oh my God, like, I'm gonna just keep doing this and refining it until I get it, until I get it. That came across. And in this crazy sort of environment that we're living in, you can't measure it. Like there's no KPI for that. There's no ROI for that stuff. But
Right.
when your people have a great opinion, point of view, thing to say about their business, and they really put lots of thought into it. As a consumer, whether it's online, offline, whatever, to me it comes across so loud and clear.
I don't disagree, Tim. Look, if I opened a pizza store, let's say we Tim and Rob's, great slices, right? I'm amazed as I travel how many bad pizza stores there are in this world, right? You would think that if we had a pizza store, we'd go to Umberto's, we'd go to Ruby Rosa, we'd go to Lucali's, we'd go to L&B, we'd go to Joe and Pat's and say, okay, what do we like about this and how do we incorporate that
Yes.
into ours? I'm amazed at how many people don't do that. And Jimmy and I, we were road warriors. We would fly to Toledo, Ohio. We'd drive to Cleveland. We'd go through Toledo. We'd go up through Detroit. We'd work our way all the way up and through Michigan to Benton Harbor, then come around to Chicago and end up in Mishawaka, where
Wow,
South
wow, wow.
Bend is. And no, we'd spend a
Yeah.
week on the road, touching every single door, including our competitors. And the theory was, if we learned one thing from this trip, it was worth it. And by the way, we're paraphrasing Sam Walton. We're not so smart. It's a good guy to paraphrase. But that was what we did. And we travel. We tried to touch every single door in the company at least once. The good doors probably twice, and the great doors maybe 4 times a year. So there was a period of time that we were on the road almost every other week. And I will say that I touched our stores every single week. So I would, on the way home, on the way to the store, I'd take a day just to branch and travel. We'd pick regions. Sometimes we could drive it, Philly, Baltimore, Washington. Sometimes we had to fly, but we were always touching the stores and looking at the competitors. And knowledge is power. If you sit in an office, you think everything's great. It's so amazing. Sometimes it was depressing to get out because you thought everything was great and
Yeah.
it
No,
wasn't.
it's so true. It's just so true.
But the defining factor was, you had to have thick skin, but you also, if you didn't see it, you couldn't fix it because you didn't know it was
No one's
broken.
going to tell you this, right? Look, there's always surprises in business. They're never good. Like there's never the surprise where you visit, a store and you find out there's all this extra business there. No, it's oh my God, like
Only during
that's
COVID that
true. By the
happened.
way, that's true.
We thought the world was falling and it was explosive.
It's very true. Look, I just want to just wrap with one thing that we both lived through, which was, Nike what really has come on a whole metamorphosis journey of opening retailers, closing doors, and then sort of getting back and reopening some in the recent months and years. But they went through COVID, and Mr. Donahoe was really on a pretty good clip of Nike owned and operated, whether it was .com, app, retail, etc. And on paper, and I think some of his internal and probably external folks probably told him, look, you know what, it's the right thing to do because there's all this digital business and all this whatever brick and mortar business, higher margins, etc., that we can go get ourselves. But in reality, I think maybe as happens in life, they swung the pendulum a little too hard and it opened the door for some other brands like On and so on. I just wondered if you could just talk to that and just the importance of having both sides of the fence, in terms of Omni and owned and operated and also authorized.
So to your Nike analogy, I think when Donahoe took over, he did swing the pendulum a little too far. Right. There was a time, and I discussed with you about redesigning the stores and what Jimmy Jazz would look like in the pyramid. That was really a gauntlet laid out by Nike. To, as I explained before, the T24, and it was, again, you are a conduit from Nike to the consumer, and how are you going to aid that journey for the consumer? Some guys took it earnestly and designed good stores, and they're still here today. Some guys tried to play three-card Monte, the shell game, and no, we designed them all. They're great, and sent pictures, but they weren't really. Right, because Nike, unlike most of the competitors at the time, traveled, and they did go to your stores.
So even their peers, even they weren't really going hitting stores. Wow.
No, not at the time. Maybe they do today,
Wow.
but they weren't. But that was important. They did close down a lot of doors that they didn't think were important to them. I think that when Donahoe came in, I think he tried to accelerate that twofold. One was closing a ton of the brick and mortar doors, because I think the idea was that they wanted more of the Nike doors, certainly in the A malls, not the B and C, but maybe down the road that was the case. And I think that they saw, much like you did, at that time, Tim, during COVID, exponential growth of the e-commerce world. And so, it went from 10 to 25% in 18 months of our business. It was insane. It was insane, the ride, right? And anything you put online, because it was artificial, right? When you're printing money and you have stimulus money, 99% of the people spend it. And what could you spend it on at the time? Restaurants were closed. There were no experiences that you could enjoy. What are you going to put rims on your car? So it was sneakers were still, of high prominence at that point, right? The releases and everything else. So they flooded us with money. It was, it was almost like we were smart. Isn't that amazing? So I think that, yeah, I know. So I think it might have been, look, obviously, if you look back, it was probably a miscalculation by John Donahoe over at Nike. I think there were some things that, happened over at Nike, but I think bringing back Elliott Hill and Tom Petty and getting the band back together is instrumental to their success. Look, those guys understood the culture. I don't think John understood the Nike culture. Elliott and Tom certainly do. And I think that, I don't want to say damage done. They're probably the best company I've ever done business with.
Look, they're making decisions, right? They were making decisions. Some of those are going to be wrong when you're doing things.
Correct.
You taught me this. You're doing things. You're going to screw stuff up, right? It's a question of just
100%.
fix it. Don't screw it up too badly, and then fix it and move on. I mean, but they were doing things, to your point.
Right. And so maybe they just did things wrong. So, like I said, bringing back Elliott and Tom is strategically brilliant. Nobody knows more about the company than those two. And I think the problem is they lost some of their luster, they lost some of their focus, and they allowed other companies into the door, which is great, by the way. There was no better time for Jimmy Jazz than when Jimmy and myself felt that competitors were starting to strangle us. It made us innovative. It made us cash rich. It made us do all the right things for the right reasons. Where if you don't have competition, you start to sit up on your hill and throw rocks down the hill just because you have nothing else to do, and it's a bad thing. Maybe Nike wasn't challenged for a very long time, and now you see Adidas is having a good year, and there was some Puma happening a while ago, and now you have On, and well, you have heritage brands like New Balance and Asics and Spot Built, which are doing great, and then you have newcomers like On and Hoka, which didn't even exist, right? And maybe if things were great and humming, wouldn't exist. So I think, again, I think that's good for the business. I think it's good for the culture. Now, how those brands address it and turn out in 5 years, let's wait and see. Nike now understands that they need some more innovation. They need some different marketing. My humble opinion, maybe they need to go back to what got them great. I think it's very simple. It's common sense, and that's what they need to do to be successful in the future.
So look, if you remember, we were kids. We watched TV, and you'd have guest star, special guest star, extra special guest star, and then like Sinatra.
You're going back to Tim. You're not that old. That's like
I know. Sinatra would show up.
You watch
What's
that
that?
reruns. You watch that in
whatever,
reruns.
but like, it would be like Sinatra would show up on Who's the Boss, right? So like this, seriously, I just want to thank you.
Okay, so now I know you're younger than me. It would be Sinatra showing up on the Love Boat.
Or that, exactly. Look, this is like that, seriously, for me. I just want to thank you. And before we wrap, any closing thoughts on this?
No, my pleasure. Listen, I only wish that the sale to Dykeman was another 4 years later, and we could have enjoyed each other's company more. But I loved every minute of you working for me. I thought it was terrific, and I think you're great, Tim. I really think you're great.
Thanks, Rob.
My pleasure. Later, guys.